Hello everyone. Um, we are into week 6, and this week we are talking about authoritarianism and its transition towards democracy. Um, Before that, in the context of talking about authoritarianism, it's on something of a bias. The bias is that when you study the government in comparative politics, most of the world, especially the Western world, there is a bias towards democracy. The idea that the democracy is the best system, fairest system, and as such, books are written about democracy. It's normal. It's a place of or institution towards which all countries should be moving towards. And having grown up myself in democracy, and I'm sure all of you also are living in democratic society, perhaps um, we all share something of similar view that we are for democratic society. Perhaps not as strongly as academics, but it is suffice to say that the reason we are choosing China is not to say not much, not as much as a study of authoritarian government that is in place there, but also to study the ways in which it is moving towards democracy. So, and also the reason why we are trying to mm, know about authoritarianism a little bit is to see what a non-democratic system looks like. So that's also the one other reason why we are doing this. So let's talk a little bit about authoritarianism. And but first, there are two terms I want you to understand. First is authoritarianism itself. So what's authoritarianism? Authoritarianism can be described as a small group of individuals exercises power over the state through a government that is not constitutionally responsible to the public. That means it cannot be removed from office in a normal ways, that is through election, and this public in general see their freedom is restricted. They won't have freedom of speech or assembly. The concept of citizenship is extremely limited so that not everybody is able to choose. So those were the regime that tends towards authoritarianism. There are several authoritarian regime and there have been many authoritarian regime in the world. Anytime a monarchy, it's a authoritarian regime unless it is a constitutional monarchy where the elected representatives have more power than the monarchy. Again, UK is not an example of authoritarianism. It is true that UK has monarchy, but it does not really exercise much power. Instead, it is the people or elected representative who are exercising the power in UK. Now, one type of authoritarian regime which is far more potent and is the other phrase which you might have heard or come across, that is totalitarianism. So, what is totalitarianism? Totalitarianism seeks to control and transform all aspects of the state, society, and economy based on strong ideology, which it will impose through violence if necessary. But this is a misused term when people talk about totalitarian regime. Um, it means authoritarian regimes. There are very limited amount of regimes that we can honestly say are completely totalitarian. For example, Chile in 1970s and 80s, when General Pinochet was in charge, I said that would be a military dictatorship. That was a military dictatorship, but it was merely an authoritarian regime. There was, other than the idea that it was not going to be a democracy, there was no major attempt to change the society. There was no major attempt to radically shift in the type of economy it had. It's true, it did slow down and it was slowly moving towards socialism. Then it moved back to capitalism, and there was no strong change. The type of regime that was more totalitarian could be if you got maybe a theocracy, a religious regime, um, mm, where it's not just the religion having the power over state, but it's also that its state wants to transform the people. Everybody has to be of certain religion. Everybody has to practice certain religion. That is really trying to radically transform the society. Then, of course, the classic example from communism are those societies that try to radically change not just the politic, not just the society, but also in the sense that people have to be socialistic, sharing certain ways, and they wanted to change the way economy is run. And it was radically transformation in true communist regime. Government owns everything. Almost all large businesses are owned by government. So it's a radical transformation of society. For example, Russia today is an authoritarian society. True, they have an election, but they tend towards authoritarianism. Maybe Mexico tended towards authoritarianism in 20th century, but they did not radically try to alter society or the economy. Instead, the society that you might consider to be totalitarianism, can anybody think of any example? I'll give you a few moments to think about it. I mean, it can be historical or current of an example of an authoritarian regime. That's right. The example, right, it's very relevant even today. It's the North Korea. Maybe I ran to a certain degree. I think um, you have Iran to a certain degree, and also China to a certain extent, totalitarian. But it is changing. In the case of China, it's changing. But most of the communist regimes were also totalitarian. This course, as it's aptly named, the democracies across society, has a bias towards democracy and the movement away from totalitarian regime to democracy. And one of the leading political scientists in 1990s, Samuel P. Huntington, um, talked about democracy, and there have been three waves of democracy. He considers it. There are three waves of democracy. His work is a bit dated because he was writing back in 1990s, but he was saying that we have reached third wave in democracies being formed, and mm, the initial wave, first wave, uh, he talks about is um, that was being formed um, is after 1980s to 1920s, and and post this this US predates this wave, and it is older than any democracy in the world. But after my 1820s and 1920s, there was a long period where countries in Europe and also in Latin America became independent, and then democratic. That kind of held off after 1920s when many societies slid back into authoritarian regimes like Italy, Germany. It was not really until the post World War of 1945 and after that we saw um, the second wave. Uh, with many European and Southeast Asian countries becoming independent from the colonies, and that period was till about 1962. After that, many of those regimes, as we saw in the case of Nigeria, reverted back to being authoritarian, usually military form of authoritarianism. Not that many is slipped into being totalitarian, but many became authoritarian, especially in Latin America and Africa, and to some extent also in East Asia. So this question is, um, we saw a third wave in of democracy being formed in countries um, becoming democratic, and he wants to know what triggered this wave. And this wave maybe started in 1974 and ended in 1990. He said there are a couple of factors. One was better able to communicate, um, and you cannot hide what you are doing from your neighbors as in the past because of the power of media. And legitimacy problems were started to rise for the authoritarian regime. This is especially true in Latin America, where there were military dictatorship and the military wants to hold on to it, but the external pressure from other countries like mainly Europe and to some extent US and also the neighbors in the Latin America that wanted democratic regimes put pressure on those authoritarian regimes to step back or go back into the system of democracy. He also says that since 1960 there was an economic growth, kind of global worldwide trend in the 60s towards economic growth that impacted democracy in a positive way. We will talk about it. That we will talk about that why it is so. But this economic growth, uh, for his for his example, he says, look at Africa, negative economic growth and lack of movement towards democracy during this period. So the countries that were able to grow economically were also becoming democratic. I find this rather dubious because if you look at East Asia countries were growing very well economically, and you see Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, but mainly for those that still, but most of those still maintain authoritarian government. For example, South Korea and Taiwan being the cases here. So they only produced what we call pseudo democracies because they were not they were not that democratic after all. I'm referring to Korea and Thailand. As usual for the scholars in the US who tend to concentrate on the religion and cultural aspect, the idea of um, Catholic Church shifted its focus after Vatican II in 1964, becoming more progressive, really adopting a philosophy going away from its strong hierarchical affinity with monarchy and the likes, and saying that people have the right to govern themselves. That might be true, but he really offers no proof of it. Huntington fails to offer any substantial proof that this has had a significant impact on the creation of wave, democratic wave across the world. that the change in Europe or even in the Latin America or like even in Poland